among the...
Click here to start from the beginning.
Escape. The route to Reykjavik. Water of library labyrinth. Gushing geyser.
Click here to start from the beginning.
Journey to the center of the earth. Looking back to all that occurred to me since that eventful day, I'm scarcely able to believe in the reality of my adventures. They were truly so wonderful that even now I'm bewildered when I think of them. It all began at my uncle's house in the oldest part of Hamburg, one of the few houses that had been spared by the Great Fire of 1842. It was a little off the perpendicular and seemed inclined to fall into the canal. My uncle, Otto Lidenbrock, was 50 years old and a very learned man. He was a professor of philosophy, chemistry, geology, mineralogy, and many other ologies. I took a deep interest in all his doings and hoped someday to be almost as learned myself. That Sunday, May the 24th, 1863, he received me in his study. It was a perfect museum containing every natural curiosity that can well be imagined. Minerals, however, predominated. I found him poring over a yellow-leafed volume, which to me appeared to possess but little value. My uncle, however, was in raptures.
Wonderful!
He cried.
Wonderful, wonderful! It is the Heimskringla of Snorre Tarlsson, the celebrated Icelandic author of the 12th century. It is a true and correct account of the Norwegian princes who once reigned in Iceland.
I was about to make a misplaced joke on the subject when a small scrap of parchment fell out of the leaves. Like a hungry man snatching at a morsel of bread, the professor seized it. It was about 5 inches by 3 inches and was scrawled over in the most extraordinary fashion.
I declare,
cried my uncle.
It is runic and contains some wonderful secret which I must get at any price. I will substitute,
he said,
a letter of our alphabet for that of the runic. We will see what that will produce.
The result appeared very strange to me. My uncle examined the words with a rapt and deep attention.
I should like to know what it means,
he said after a long pause.
The manuscript volume and the smaller document are written in different hands,
he said.
The cryptograph is of much later date than the book. To me, it appears probable that this sentence was written by some owner of the book.
Professor Lidenbrock took off his spectacles. Taking a powerful magnifying glass, he examined the book carefully. On the flyleaf was what appeared to be a blot of ink, but on examination he made out more runic characters.
Arne Saknussemm,
he translated in a joyous and triumphant tone.
That is not only an Icelandic name, but that of a learned professor of the 16th century, a celebrated alchemist. This man, Saknussemm,
he went on,
was a very learned man. He probably, like most learned men of his time, wrote in Latin, and barbarous Latin too. Probably we shall find that the phrase is arranged to some mathematical plan. No doubt a certain sentence has been written out, then jumbled up. But how?
The professor then read out to me a list of letters, taking a letter at a time from each column, which I then wrote down.
But it still makes no sense,
he cried. I took up the execrable puzzle and tried every imaginable way of grouping the letters. It was enough to drive one mad. My eyes strained with looking at the parchment. I was stifling. I wanted air. I fanned myself with the document, seeing first the back and then the front. Imagine my surprise when suddenly I clearly made out Latin words. I had discovered the secret. All you had to do to understand the document was to read it backwards. "Uncle," I cried, "mark it from right to left."
Backwards?
he shouted in wild amazement.
Oh, most cunning Saknussemm!
He snatched the document and read it out as I had done, starting from the end. It was in dog Latin, which, when translated, became...
Descend into the crater of Yocul of Sneffels, which the shade of Scartaris caresses before the calends of July, audacious traveller, and you will reach the centre of the earth. I did, Arne Saknussemm.
My uncle leapt 3 feet from the ground with joy. He punched the air.
What's o'clock?
He said. About 3.
We can start at once. Get my portmanteau and your own ready.
Oh, what for?
A journey to the centre of the earth.
While preparations for our journey began, my uncle explained what the mysterious message might mean.
The whole of Iceland is composed of volcanoes,
He told me.
They all bear the name of Yocul, which is Icelandic for glacier, because the volcanic eruptions come from ice-bound caverns.
But what, I asked, is meant by Sneffels? Said the professor.
It's a mountain about 5,000 feet in height. One of the most remarkable in the whole island, and now certainly doomed to be the most celebrated in the world. For through its extinct crater we shall reach the centre of the earth.
What about the burning lava? I said.
There are about 300 volcanoes on the whole surface of the globe, but most are extinct. Sneffels is one of them.
And Scartaris and the calends of July? The professor reflected deeply. Then he said,
Sneffels has many craters. Saknussemm has pointed to the exact one which is the highway to the interior of the earth. He tells us that about the end of the month of June, the shadow of Mount Scartaris falls upon the one crater. There can be no doubt about the matter.
Saknussemm is right, I said. He found the entrance to the bowels of the earth. Let's go and see, though how we can do that in the dark is a mystery.
Fear nothing,
replied my uncle.
We shall overcome all such difficulties.
Next day, at 5 o'clock in the morning, the post-chaise was at the door for the start of our adventurous journey. From Hamburg, the railway took us to Kiel, where we transferred to a steamship. Our next stop was the capital of Denmark, Copenhagen, where we were to join the good ship Valkyrie for the voyage to Iceland. The schooner entered the channel, and within the hour, the land seemed to sink into the waves. Towards evening, we crossed the Skagerrak, cut across the tip of Norway, and entered the North Sea. 2 days later, we sighted the coast of Scotland, passed between Orkney and Shetland, and reached the Faroe Islands. On the 11th day, we reached Iceland and steered towards Reykjavik. My uncle pointed to a high mountain.
Behold,
he said,
Mount Sneffels.
We were met by Mr. Fridriksson, professor of natural science in the College of Reykjavik, who invited us to his house.
Well, Mr. Fridriksson,
my uncle said at dinner that night,
I was desirous of ascertaining if, among your oldest books, you had any of Arne Saknussemm.
Saknussemm! cried our host. You speak of that great scholar of the 16th century, of that great naturalist, that great alchemist, that great traveller.
Exactly so.
One of the most distinguished men of Icelandic literature and science.
As you say, sir.
One of the most illustrious of men.
True, but what of his works?
His works? We have none of them. Arne Saknussemm was persecuted for heresy, and in 1573 all his works were publicly burnt at Copenhagen by the hand of the common hangman.
Good, capital,
said my uncle, to the astonishment of the Icelander. He went on,
I now understand why Arne Saknussemm, put out of court and forced to hide his magnificent discoveries, was compelled to conceal beneath the veil of an incomprehensible cryptograph the secret.
What secret? asked Mr. Fridriksson.
A secret which...
stammered my uncle. Have you discovered some wonderful manuscript? cried Mr. Fridriksson.
No, I was carried away by my enthusiasm, a mere supposition.
Fortunately, Mr. Fridriksson decided to change the subject. "I hope you will not leave our island without examining its mineral riches," he said. "You have no idea how many unknown mountains, glaciers, volcanoes there are which remain to be studied. Without moving from where we sit, I can show you one. It is called Sneffels, one of the most curious volcanoes in existence. Its crater is rarely visited."
Extinct?
asked my uncle. "Extinct for the last 600 years.
Excellent,
said my uncle, who was crossing and uncrossing his legs to prevent himself jumping for joy.
I have decided to begin my studies with an examination of the geological mysteries of this Mount Sneffels. I will endeavour to climb its summit and, if possible, descend into its crater.
Mr. Friedrichsen said he regretted not being able to accompany us, but would arrange a reliable guide. The next day he introduced us to a man of tall stature and perfect Herculean build, who was called Hans Bjelke. He was obviously possessed of great strength. His eyes started rather prominently from a very large head. He appeared to be very quick and intelligent. His long hair, which even in England would have been accounted exceedingly red, fell over his athletic shoulders. This native of Iceland was supple in appearance, though he scarcely moved his arms while listening to my uncle's wild gesticulations. He told us the distance to Sneffels was about 22 miles, a journey which we supposed would take about 2 days. His engagement with my uncle was by no means to cease with the arrival at Sneffels. Although we didn't tell him then, he was to accompany us all the way to the interior of the earth. The instruments we were to take with us included 1. A centigrade thermometer by Eigel, graduated up to 150 degrees. If the temperature ever went that high, we would certainly be cooked. 2. A manometer, which was worked by compressed air. This would show us the increase in atmospheric pressure as we went further underground. 3. A first-class chronometer made by Boissanos of Geneva and set to the Hamburg meridian. 4. A night glass. 5. 2 compasses to measure both positive and negative inclination. 6. 2 Ruhmkorff lamps, which were very easy to carry and would provide us with electric light when we were in complete darkness. We also packed rifles, revolvers, gunpowder, ice picks, pickaxes, an axe, a hammer, lengths of rope, and a silken ladder 300 feet long. For provisions, we took a large quantity of dried meat and biscuits, as well as gin and tobacco. Finally, we ensured we had plenty of medical supplies. We left Reykjavik with Hans walking at a steady, rapid and unvarying step. He was followed by 2 horses carrying our luggage. My uncle and I came behind, mounted on small but vigorous horses. The journey lasted many days, during which my uncle partly confided in Hans and told him it was his intention to explore the volcano to its limits. Hans listened calmly, then nodded his head. To bury himself in the bowels of the earth or to travel to its summits was all the same to him. But one thought began to trouble me. We had seen no evidence to prove that Sneffels was really extinct. What proof was there that an eruption was not shortly to take place? Because the monster has slept soundly since 1229, does it follow that he is never to wake? In the end, I could stand it no longer. I decided to put the case to my uncle. If he does awake, what is to become of us? I asked.
It is now 600 years since Sneffels has spoken,
he said.
But volcanic eruptions are always preceded by perfectly well-known phenomena. I have questioned many of the local inhabitants. I have studied the soil. I can assure you, Axel, there will be no eruption.
He took me into the open country. It was littered with enormous rocks of basalt, granite, lava, and other volcanic substances. Here and there, giant spouts of steam rose into the air from hot springs underground.
You see all this steam?
Asked my uncle.
As long as you see them like this, you have nothing to fear from the volcano.
But how can that be? I asked.
Remember this,
continued the professor.
At the approach of an eruption, these spouts redouble their activity. But they disappear completely when the phenomenon actually begins. you may be quite sure that there is no fear of any immediate eruption.
But...
Enough, my boy! When science has spoken, one must hear and...
This important matter settled and back with the rest of the party, Hans gave the signal for the start of our climb up the 5,000 feet high volcano of Sneffels. We walked in single file, preceded by Hans, up narrow paths where two persons could not possibly walk abreast. As we advanced, the route became more and more difficult and dangerous. Rocks broke and gave way under our feet, rushing to the plains below like a series of small avalanches. Then, as I looked down, I saw a prodigious volume of pulverized pumice stone, sand and dust. It was rising to the heavens like a mighty waterspout, the wind driving it to the mountainside where we perched. "Hastig, hastig!" cried our guide. I certainly knew nothing of Danish, but I well understood his meaning. We quickly hastened out of the area. Then we watched as the gigantic whirlwind of sand passed the very spot we had been. But for the precaution and knowledge of our guide, our dislocated bodies, our crushed and broken limbs would have been cast to the wind like dust from some unknown meteor. We continued our painful ascent for another 5 hours. Finally, we stood on the summit and prepared to descend into the crater that was to shelter us for the night. The crater of Mount Sneffels formed an inverted cone, the mouth half a mile across and thousands of feet deep. Imagine how it must have been when full of flame and thunder. It reminded me of a giant loaded cannon. It terrified me. To descend into the interior of a cannon, I thought to myself, when it may be loaded and could go off at the least shock, is the act of a madman. I felt like a lamb being led to slaughter. At the bottom were 3 separate shafts through which, when Sneffels was in action, burning lava and poisonous fumes would pour. The professor went to inspect them, running from one to the other. Suddenly, he shouted,
Axel, come here! Make haste! Look at this.
On the side of a giant boulder were the same runic characters, now eaten away by time.
Arne Saknussemm,
Cried my uncle.
can you now have any doubt?
Hans, my uncle, and I passed our first night at the bottom of the crater. Next day, the sky was dark and grey. My uncle was devoured with rage. The reason was simple. Of the 3 openings yawning beneath us, only one had been followed by the adventurous Saknussemm. According to the ancient cryptogram, it would only be known when the shadow of Scartaris fell on it. But with no sun, there was no shadow, and no chance of finding the right route. For days there had been no change in the weather. My uncle was almost frantic. Then, when we had almost given up hope, the sun's rays began to move across the bottom of the crater. To my uncle's insane delight, the shadow of Scartaris was marked and clear as it slowly moved over the rocks. And at 12 o'clock exactly, when the sun had attained its highest altitude, the shadow fell right upon the central pit.
We have found it!
Gasped the professor.
Forward, my friends, into the interior of the Earth.
Our real journey now commenced. The hole itself measured about 100 feet across.
The adventure begins. Library Labyrinth. Welcome to the Hamburg Library. Welcome to the Hamburg. Hope you enjoy your stay. Which way to go? My word, it's very dusty here. Solve the code. Which way to go? Welcome to the Hamburg. Among the ancient, the adventure begin water of life, the route to Reykjavik. Into the crater. Lava leap. Water of into the crater.
Our real journey now commenced. The hole itself measured about 100 feet across. I leaned over a rock which stood on the edge and looked down. My hair...
The adventure began the route to Reykjavik.
Next day, at 5 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Friedrichsen said he regretted not being able to accompany us. Next day, the sky was dark and grey. My uncle was devoured with rage. The reason was simple. Of the 3 openings yawning beneath us, only one had been followed by the adventurous Saknussemm. According to the ancient cryptogram, it would only be known when the shadow of Skartaris fell on it. But with no sun, there was no shadow, and no chance of finding the right route. For days there had been no change in the weather. My uncle was almost frantic. Then, when we had almost given up hope, the sun's rays began to move across the bottom of the crater. To my uncle's insane delight, the shadow of Skartaris was marked and clear as it slowly moved over the rocks. And at 12 o'clock exactly, when the sun had attained its highest altitude, the shadow fell right upon the central pit.
We have found it!
Gasped the professor.
Forward, my friends, into the interior of the earth.
Our real journey now commenced. The hole itself measured about 100 feet across. I leaned over a rock which stood on the edge and looked down. My hair stood on end, my limbs trembled. I was looking down a wild and savage staircase without a banister.
Let us see about the baggage,
said my uncle.
The fragile objects must be divided into 3 separate parcels, and each of us must carry one on his back. Hans will carry the tools and some of the provisions. Axel will take more of the provisions and the firearms. I will take the rest and the more delicate instruments.
My uncle was certainly not fond of half measures. He had Hans tie the whole of the non-fragile articles into one bundle. This packet was firmly and solidly fastened with strong rope. Then it was simply pitched over the edge of the gulf.
Now then,
He cried.
it's our turn.
The descent then began in the following order. Hans went first, my uncle followed, and I went last. We lowered ourselves on a rope which seemed hardly able to bear the weight of 3 people. The silence was only disturbed by the sound of pieces of rock falling beneath us as we went down. After 3 hours, we seemed to be as far as ever from the bottom of the well. Still we continued to descend, and all the time it was getting darker. We had started at 1 o'clock. By about 11 o'clock at night, I estimated we were some 5,000 feet down. Then I heard the voice of Hans from below.
Halt! We have reached the end of the journey,
Said the worthy professor in a satisfied air. What, the interior of the earth? Said I, slipping down to their sides.
No, you stupid fellow.
He said.
But we have reached the bottom of the chimney.
Can we make no further progress? I asked, rather hoping that our adventure might be at an end.
Oh, yes.
He said.
I can dimly see a sort of tunnel which turns to the right. Let us eat and sleep now, and continue on the morrow.
By the dim light, we opened our food bags. Then we lay down and tried to sleep on our beds of stone. At 8 o'clock the next morning, a faint kind of dawn awoke us. Rays of daylight glinted from the lava walls. We were able to see objects around us with ease,
We have only just reached the ground level of the island.
said the professor.
This long vertical tube, which starts at the bottom of the crater of Sneffels, stops here at sea level.
We consulted the barometer to confirm this, but my uncle said he would prefer to use the manometer from this point. With the weight of air becoming greater than its pressure at sea level, our barometer would now become useless. But, I asked my uncle, how will we be able to stand the increasing pressure?
We shall descend very slowly, and so our lungs will gradually get used to breathing condensed air.
He said.
It is well known that aeronauts have gone so high as to be nearly without air at all. As we descend, we may perhaps have too much. We shall see.
As my uncle made this remark, he turned on the Ruhmkorff lamp. Hans was carrying the second lamp, which he also switched on. The effect was magical. This most ingenious application of electricity to practical purposes was to enable us to move along by the light of an artificial day. Lava flowing through this tunnel in 1229 had lined it with crystals of opaque quartz. Limpid clusters of natural glass hung from the roof and seemed to take fire as we passed beneath them. Magnificent! I couldn't help shouting at the wonder of it all. After 10 hours walking, we sat down to eat. We ate ravenously. One thing, however, caused us great uneasiness. Our water reserve was already half exhausted. We had only 5 days' supply left, but my uncle was confident we would find subterranean resources. I was also surprised that the heat was not greater than it was.
What does the thermometer say?
Asked the professor. Scarcely 15 degrees, I said. It's an increase of only 9 degrees since we left.
What do you make of that?
He asked. Well, I explained as best I could, we know from observations that temperature increases for every 100 feet you go into the interior of the Earth. But that figure can depend on the locality. For instance, near an extinct volcano, as we are here, the increase is only 1 degree for every 125 feet. So 9 times 125 feet gives us a depth of 1,125 feet.
Not so,
replied the professor.
My own observations show we are now 10,000 feet below sea level.
The professor's calculations were perfectly correct. We were already 6,000 feet deeper down in the bowels of the earth than anyone had ever been before. But the temperature, which should have been 81 degrees, was in this place only 15 degrees. This was a matter to which we would have to give serious consideration. The next day we resumed our journey. There was a sudden change in the walls on either side of us. Instead of being coated with shining lava as before, they now looked more like living rock. We had arrived there after reaching an intersection of 4 somber and narrow tunnels. The question that faced us now was, which one of them should we take? My uncle had no hesitation about the matter and pointed to the eastern tunnel. We entered it, trusting to chance it was the right one, and found ourselves in the middle of the Silurian period. "Look!" I shouted to my uncle. "This is when the first plants and animals appeared." On the walls I could clearly make out the outlines of seaweed, and I found myself treading on a soft dust, all that remained of ancient plants and shells. I stopped and picked up an almost perfect shell. "What is this?" I asked.
Well,
said the professor,
it is the shell of a crustaceous animal of the order of trilobites. This indicates we have finally abandoned the crust of lava and the road by which the lava ascended. We may have taken the wrong tunnel.
My worry was that these rocks did not contain water, and we were running short. By now we were all beginning to feel the first pangs of thirst. We needed to replenish our stock of water very soon. We were now in a mighty natural cavern about 100 feet wide and 150 feet high. Evidently the earth had been cast apart here by some violent commotion, leaving a vast gap in which we were the first people to penetrate. I leaned my hand on the rock and found it had turned black. "A coal mine!" I cried.
A coal mine without miners,
said my uncle.
This gallery was not cut by man.
On the dark walls was written the whole history of the coal period. A geologist could have easily read its different stages of formation. The seams of coal were separated by compressed strata of sandstone and clay. At one time the earth was covered by rich vegetation created by the tropical heat and perpetual humidity. It was this exuberant vegetation that, lying at the bottom of the sea, had turned first into peat and then into coal. Then a wall blocked our further progress. In no way could we continue.
Now we know we are not on the route taken by Saknussemm,
said my uncle.
We shall have to go back.
Yes, I said, if our strength lasts. Tomorrow there will be no water left. We returned to the crossroads, and this time we resumed by means of the western gallery. Hans was in front as usual. But now our supply of water had given out. I would have bartered a diamond mine for a glass of pure spring water. Soon I was in terrible pain. I could go no further and fell to the ground. Desperately I cried, "Help! I'm dying!" But my companions were motionless. Were they asleep or dead? Would any of us ever again see the light of day? Then I saw the Icelander get up and creep away from us, lamp in hand. Why was he abandoning us? I tried to cry out, but my voice could find no way through my parched lips. After a long, weary wait, I heard the sound of footsteps. Hans was returning. He went straight to my uncle. "Warten," said Hans. I did not understand a single word of Danish, yet the meaning was clear. "Oh, water! Water!" I cried, gesticulating like a madman. Summoning all our strength, we followed him as he led the way down. Then I heard an accustomed and well-known sound, a kind of dull and sullen roar, like that of a distant waterfall.
Hans was right,
Said my uncle.
An underground river is flowing beside us.
We could hear it clearly, roaring and rushing behind the granite wall. Only 2 feet separated us from the precious liquid. I could bear the suspense and suffering no longer. Hans looked at me, and I thought I could see a smile on his face. Then he placed his ear against the dry stone, searching for the spot where it sounded the loudest. He lifted up his pickaxe and started attacking the rock. Almost immediately, we heard a loud and welcome hiss. Then a jet of water burst through the wall. The force almost knocked Hans down, and he uttered a cry of pain. It was scalding hot.
Never mind, it will soon cool down,
Said my uncle. And before long we were able to swallow huge mouthfuls.
Gushing geyser, gushing geyser, gushing, lost. Among the ancients, among the ancients. Gushing water of life, gushing geyser. Water of water.
What ecstasy! What incomparable luxury! Where it came from I could not care. It was water, and though still hot, it brought life back to our hearts. I drank it greedily. But then I made a discovery. "It tastes of iron!" I shouted.
And excellent for the stomach,
Said my uncle.
It's full of minerals. It may taste of ink, but it's not disagreeable.
"Come," I said. "Let us fill our water bottles and then try to plug the hole,"
No need.
said the professor.
There is more than enough water. Let it run. It will find its own way down, and will serve to guide as well as refresh us.
"A great idea," I said. "With this stream as a companion, there is no further reason why we should not succeed."
Let us press on.
By the following day, we had already forgotten about our sufferings. We breakfasted with a good appetite, drinking our fill of the excellent water. "Let's be moving," I cried, and off we started along the granite tunnel, the stream flowing quietly at our feet. Our path now began to trend downwards in earnest. Then, when our estimate showed we had reached a depth of about 6 miles, we received another unexpected surprise. A frightening well suddenly opened up at our feet.
This will take us a long way,
Cried my uncle in rapturous delight.
The projections from the rock form an ideal staircase.
The well was a kind of narrow opening in the mass of granite. The stream was cascading down the hole, and we began to follow. Down we went, during the whole of 2 days, penetrating further into the crust of the earth. Our path eventually became a much more gentle slope towards the southeast. Soon, we reached a giant grotto, through which our stream still flowed. The professor took his instruments and said he wanted to verify our position.
Take the compass and examine how she points.
He told me. "East 1/4 southeast," I replied.
Very good.
He said, doing some rapid calculations.
I make out we have covered 250 miles from our departure point.
"Then the mighty waves of the Atlantic are rolling over our heads," I observed.
And whales are playing in shoals, thrashing their tails against the bottom of the sea, the roof of our prison. Don't worry, they have no means of breaking through.
He assured me.
Not only are we 250 miles from Sneffels, but we have already reached a depth of 50 miles.
50 miles? I exclaimed. But that is the limit allowed by science for the thickness of the Earth's crust. And according to all known laws on the increase of heat, the temperature should now be 1,500 degrees.
As you say, my boy.
He answered. In which case, all this solid granite would be melted.
But you perceive that is not so. What heat does the thermometer indicate?
I looked and said, "Why, 25.6 degrees.
So,
He said,
science is wrong by 1,474.4 degrees. The theory that temperature increases as you go lower has now been proved to be incorrect.
For weeks, we traveled deeper into the bowels of the earth. My own calculations had shown that at the present rate of descent, we should take about 5.5 years to reach the center of the earth. Completely absorbed in my work as we went along, I was examining a piece of granite by means of the lamp, when I suddenly realized I was completely alone. Evidently, I had become separated from my companions and had entered a different gallery. My situation could be summed up in 3 awful words. Lost. 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 In the middle of this anguish, a new horror took possession of my soul. I dropped the lamp. Then, as I wandered aimlessly around, the earth failed me. I found I was falling down a vertical gallery. My head struck against a sharp rock, and I lost consciousness. Death seemed to be about to claim me.
Lost. Among the ancients. Lost. The inland sea. Lost.
For weeks, we traveled deeper into the bowels of the earth. When I came to, I saw my uncle and Hans looking down on me.
He lives! He lives!
Cried my uncle. I had awoken in a charming grotto, adorned with magnificent stalagmites, glittering in all the colors of the rainbow. The floor was a soft and silvery sand. No lamps were needed. A bright light penetrated through a narrow opening in the wall of the grotto. Then I heard a vague murmur, like waves breaking on a beach and the whistling of a wind. I thought I must be dreaming, or perhaps we had returned to the surface of the earth. Then I heard my uncle speaking.
It is indeed a miracle that you were not killed 1,000 times over,
He said.
But rest now, for tomorrow we must set sail.
Sail? I cried, more bewildered than ever.
Yes, indeed.
Said my uncle.
Tomorrow we must be ready to go on board.
My uncle tried to restrain me, but I scrambled to my feet and rushed outside the grotto. What a surprise greeted me. In my wildest imagination, I would never have conjured up such a scene. The sea! The sea, I cried. A vast expanse of water spread before us until it was lost in the distance. The tremendous vault over our heads, the sky, so to speak, appeared to consist of clouds of swirling water vapors. Electric currents created astonishing plays of light among them, reflected on the enormous cliffs that reared up on all sides. But for me, the effect was sad and melancholy, for I realized that far above those clouds there must be a heavy roof of granite weighing down on us. After being imprisoned underground for 47 days, it was a delight to breathe this salt sea air.
Well,
Said my uncle.
do you feel strong enough to go for a stroll?
Certainly, was my ready answer. Nothing would give me greater pleasure. In the distance I saw a strange forest. It consisted of straight trunks with tufted tops like sunshades.
It's a forest of mushrooms.
Cried my uncle. He was right. There were thousands of them growing up to 40 feet in height. New wonders were everywhere. Around us were other groups of trees like those on Mother Earth, but of a phenomenal size. There were flowering ferns as tall as pines and gigantic grasses.
Astonishing. Magnificent. Splendid.
Cried my uncle.
Here we have humble garden plants, which became trees in the first centuries of the earth. Look around you. No botanist ever before gazed on such a sight. It is like a mighty hothouse, my boy. But let us remember, it could also be a vast menagerie. Look what we are standing on. These are the bones of prehistoric animals.
I looked at the bones that lay scattered around. They resembled dried-up tree trunks. I could even name some of them. Here is the lower jawbone of a mastodon, I said. The molars of a dinotherium. And the thigh bone of the biggest of them all, the megatherium. But how could such giant beasts come to be in this granite cavern?
There is a simple answer.
Replied the professor.
At one time, the Earth consisted only of an elastic crust, subject to alternate upward and downward movement due to the law of gravity. And there must have been landslides, with large portions of sedimentary soil being cast into huge and mighty chasms.
That's possible, I remarked. But if prehistoric animals lived down here, it is likely one of those monsters may now be lurking behind one of those steep rocks.
Then we have no time to lose,
Cried my uncle.
We must set sail tomorrow.
The next morning, we set off in search of more adventures. Hans had managed to make a raft out of fossilized tree trunks he'd found. It was about 10 feet long and 5 feet wide, bound together with stout ropes. With us, we carried our instruments, luggage, food, and a generous supply of water from a nearby stream. Hans had made a rudder, mast, and sail, allowing us to guide the raft with ease. The trouble was, we were no longer going down, but sailing to the unknown. The professor grumbled.
This voyage on a raft over a pond annoys me. We are not progressing with our discoveries.
Often we tried to find the depth of the water using an iron bar attached to a long rope. One day, we had great difficulty reeling it in. We soon found out why. On it, were deep marks, as though it had been crushed between two hard objects. "They're the marks of teeth!" I cried, and I wondered what jaws must be the owner of such molars be possessed of. Suddenly, Hans pointed to where, about 200 yards away, a huge black mass was moving up and down. My worst fears were realized. "It's a colossal monster!" I cried in terror.
Lost among the ancients, the inland sea, into the abyss, into the inland battle of the monsters. Look!
Observed the professor in some agitation.
It's a huge sea lizard of terrible size and shape. And there's also a giant crocodile. See his great jaws and rows of monstrous teeth. And a whale! A whale! Look at that enormous tail.
Two hideous monsters spotted us and advanced towards the raft. I picked up my rifle in desperation, though I knew it could have had little effect against them. Then they made a rush at one another. My uncle coolly watched their gigantic struggle through his telescope.
I thought so,
he cried.
One is that most fearful of all prehistoric reptiles, the ichthyosaurus.
And the other? I asked.
A serpent concealed under the hard shell of a turtle, the plesiosaurus.
They attacked one another with tremendous fury. Such a giant combat had never before been seen by mortal eye. The battle went on for hours. We crouched on the raft, weapons pointed towards them, and determined not to perish without a struggle. Suddenly, the creatures disappeared beneath the waves. Several minutes went by in silence. Was this combat to end in the ocean depths? Then an enormous mass rose out of the water. It was the head of the great plesiosaurus. The terrible creature had been mortally wounded. I could see nothing of his enormous shell-like body, only his serpent-like neck, which twisted and curled in the agony of death. It struck the water like a gigantic whip, then wriggled like a worm cut in two. Water spurted in all directions. Then its violent movements slackened, and at last the body of the mighty snake stretched out across the now calm water. Danger over for now. Our voyage continued even further into the unknown. Many days passed without further incidents. Our observation showed we had already traveled nearly 800 miles across this sea, and that our position was exactly under England. It was now August the 21st, and we could sense the calm weather we had been enjoying was about to change. A distant sound of thunder became louder and louder, and suddenly we were in the midst of a wild and raging tempest. It came from the most distant corners of the mighty cavern. It roared, it yelled, it shrieked with the glee of demons. The raft rose and fell with the storm. It moved faster and faster before the wind. Would the storm never end? We appeared doomed. The mast and sail were carried away. I saw them swept into the sky to a great height. We were frozen in terror. Then, a ball of fire, half white, half blue, the size of a 10-inch bombshell, swooped towards us, darting here, there, and everywhere with great rapidity. It approached my uncle, who fell to his knees to avoid it. Then it came towards me as I stood, pale and shuddering in the dazzling light and heat. It danced around my feet. They seemed to be riveted to the deck. Instruments, tools, firearms, all clanged together with an awful noise. I realized what had happened. The electric globe had magnetized all the iron on board. Suddenly, the globe burst, and we were enveloped in cascades of living fire. The next thing I remembered, I was stretched out on the burning sand, lying alongside my uncle. The violent storm had smashed our raft on the rocks, throwing us into the boiling sea. It was only fearless Hans who had saved us from certain death. I could see him now, salvaging our supplies from the wreck and lining them up on the sand. Thanks to his superhuman efforts, most had been saved, including all our precious instruments. But where were we now? I turned to my uncle. My calculations show we must be 2,500 miles from Reykjavik and now under the Mediterranean, I said.
Let us check,
said my uncle, reaching for the compass. He looked at it in disbelief, shook it, and looked at it again. Then he stared at me in alarm and passed it to me. The needle pointed north to where we expected would be south. During the tempest, a sudden change of wind must have brought the raft back to the shore it had left.
Yes, among the ancients, the inland sea, among the ancients. Into the abyss, battle of the monsters.
The next thing I remember, there was no mistaking the rage that was written on my uncle's face. Never have I seen a man more crestfallen and then so indignant. It was as though all the dangers we had gone through had been for nothing. The professor shouted out his defiance.
Fate is playing terrible tricks.
He fumed.
But I will not yield. I shall not retreat an inch. We shall see who can triumph, man or nature.
I tried to make him see reason. We cannot fight the impossible, I said. We are ill-equipped for a sea voyage. We cannot again travel on this pile of beams with just a blanket for a sail and a stick for a mast. It is madness for us to carry on. But my uncle would not listen.
Tomorrow we shall set sail again,
he announced.
But as fate has cast us on these shores again, we must at least devote a little time to examining them.
Leaving Hans working on the raft, we started off along the shore. As we walked, our feet crushed innumerable shells of every shape and size, once the homes of animals from every period of creation. Here and there were the remains of every kind of prehistoric monster. My uncle was in his element. His mouth was wide open, his eyes glinted behind his spectacles, his whole face displayed utter astonishment. Then he cried,
"Axel! A human!"
What we had found was a perfectly preserved human body. Propped up against a rock, it seemed to watch us from its hollow eye sockets. The professor announced,
"This is a fossil man, who was alive at the same time as the mastodons, whose bones lie all around us here. But how he or they got here from the earth above us, I have no clue."
We continued our expedition, but became more and more uneasy, wondering if any other strange creatures could still be wandering around near the shore of this giant sea. Were other revelations waiting for us in this great cavern? Ahead, we could see an immense forest of giant conifers, but they lacked one thing: color. Deprived of the light of the sun, they appeared faded and brown. We were about to see what surprises this forest might hold, when I suddenly stopped. I held my uncle back. As if in a dream, we could see gigantic elephants moving through the foliage, and we could hear the sound of their tusks uprooting whole trees. My uncle seized my arm.
"Come!"
he shouted.
"Let us go closer."
"No!" I replied. "We are unarmed. No human creature could face the anger of these monsters."
"No human creature,"
he said.
"You are wrong. Look, over there."
Appearing from behind a tree was what was obviously a human being. He was a giant of a man, over 12 feet tall, with a head as big as a buffalo's and a huge mane of matted hair. In his hand, he clutched a massive branch. "Run for it!" I shouted. Speechless with shock, we began to return to where we had left the raft. We were making our way over some rocks when I spotted something shining in the sand. I stooped to pick it up.
"What is it?"
asked the professor. I showed him a rusty knife. It must be a weapon of some prehistoric warrior, I said. But it can't be. It isn't from the Stone Age or even the Bronze Age. This is made of steel. My uncle stopped me short.
Calm yourself,
he said.
This knife is Spanish from the 16th century. Look at the rust. It has been lying here for 1, 2, or 300 years. See its jagged edges, as if it has been used to carve an inscription on the rocks. It is obvious someone must have been here before us.
But who? I asked.
A man who has written his name with this very dagger. A man who has tried once again to show the right road to the interior of the earth.
We looked around. Then we noticed at the foot of the cliffs the entrance to a dark and gloomy tunnel. And there, carved on a slab of granite, we could see 2 half-worn letters. They were the 2 initials of the bold adventurer who had preceded us here.
A.S.
cried my uncle.
I was right. Arne Saknussemm has been here.
Since we had started on our journey, I had experienced many surprises, but none compared to the sight of those 2 letters engraved 300 years before. Now, I could no longer doubt the existence of the learned traveller. The professor was impatient to continue in Saknussemm's footsteps, and we started towards the dark tunnel.
The horizontal sea was taking us nowhere,
he said.
Now we shall continue to go down and down. We have less than 5,000 miles to travel. But first, go and find Hans and bring him here.
We entered the tunnel and switched on our Ruhmkorff lamps. But we had not gone far before we were stopped by an enormous block of granite. In vain we tried to find a way round it, but our path was completely blocked. We were bitterly disappointed. My uncle angrily paced up and down.
What about Saknussemm?
He asked. It's obvious, I said, that this has happened since Saknussemm returned to the surface. Perhaps this tunnel was the outlet for the pent-up lava in the interior of the Earth, with the eruption flowing freely and carrying giant rocks along with it. One day, after an unusually strong shock, this rock fell and blocked the passage.
Pickaxes!
Cried my uncle.
We'll force a way through.
No, I replied, it's far too hard.
Then gunpowder!
He cried.
We'll blow it up. Hands to work.
The Icelander placed the explosive and laid the fuse. Then we left the tunnel and took the raft out to the open sea away from danger. Sparks hissed and spluttered along the fuse. Seconds passed. Then the whole world seemed to explode. We saw the rocks drawn aside like curtains, and a fathomless void opened up before us. The sea became one giant wave, which was carrying us into the abyss. Nothing could be heard but the bellowing of the water, and we clung together on the raft in utter silence. I soon realized what had happened. The explosion had set off a kind of earthquake, and the gulf it had opened up was about to swallow the inland sea, now transformed into a mighty river, and was carrying us with it. This time we were really lost. We held each other tight so as not to be thrown off the raft as it plunged down and down. There was no doubt this had been the road followed by Saknussemm, but instead of going down it as he had done, we had brought down a whole sea with us. Our speed got faster and faster. We no longer seemed to be sliding, but falling straight down. Then we felt a sharp shock, as though we'd hit a hard object. The fall stopped abruptly. The constant roaring was replaced by utter silence. Then I heard my uncle shout,
"We're going upwards!" Just as I thought,
said my uncle.
We are in a narrow shaft, just 30 feet wide. The water that brought us down here has reached the bottom. Now it is forcing itself upwards and taking us along with it.
We were rising faster and faster. Every so often we found it difficult to breathe, as happens to aeronauts who ascend too quickly. But while aeronauts feel colder as they go higher into the atmosphere, here we were experiencing the opposite effect. The temperature was rising. By now it must have reached 40 degrees centigrade. If we aren't drowned, or smashed to pieces or die of starvation, we have every chance of being burned alive, I cried. But my uncle wasn't listening. He was examining the strata through which we were passing.
Eruptive granite,
He said.
We're still in the primitive period, and we're still climbing.
It was also getting much hotter. The atmosphere was burning. Then the very water beneath us started to boil. Explosion after explosion deafened us. "Uncle," I cried, "this is the end. These are all the signs of an earthquake."
Not an earthquake,
He said.
but something much better.
"What do you mean by that?" I shouted.
An eruption.
He said. So that was to be our fate. We were about to be cast back upon Mother Earth through the gaping crater of a volcano. It was like being shot out of a giant cannon. Rising on a sea of red-hot lava amid a cloud of ashes, the raft flew through the air, and I lost consciousness. When I came to, I felt the strong hand of Hans clutching my belt. With his other hand, he was holding my uncle. We were lying on the slope of a mountain, next to a precipice over which I would have fallen had Hans not saved me. We had not the slightest idea where we had arrived. It was certainly not Iceland. Below us, we could see a forest of green. There were olive and fig trees and vines heavy with purple grapes. Above us was the crater of the volcano, from which every quarter of an hour came a loud explosion and an intense jet of flame.
We must get away from here quickly,
Said my uncle. After 2 long hours' march, we arrived in beautiful countryside, where we found a spring of fresh water and unlimited grapes and pomegranates to refresh us. While we were enjoying our rest, a child appeared from between the trees. "Look," I cried, "here's an inhabitant of this happy country." My uncle asked him, in German, for the name of the mountain.
Was is
But
that?
the child just stared at him.
Good.
Said my uncle.
We're not in Germany.
He repeated the question in English.
What is
Again,
that?
there was no answer.
Is he dumb?
Cried the professor, who was proud of his knowledge of languages. He tried again in French.
Also no.
Still silence.
Then I shall try again in Italian.
He persisted, beginning to get angry. He shouted to the child.
Dove noi siamo?
"Stromboli," answered the little shepherd boy. Stromboli! Stromboli! I could not stop repeating it to myself. So we had arrived on the island of Sicily, in the middle of the Mediterranean. And what an amazing journey we had been on to get here. We had entered the earth by one volcano and had come out by another. We were almost 3,000 miles from Sneffels, from the land of eternal snows to this most beautiful island. But neither my uncle nor I could get over the mystery of the compass. "How can it be explained?" I asked. "It always showed us going northwards, yet we have obviously been travelling south. Why not just forget the whole thing?"
What?
Exclaimed my uncle.
It would be a disgrace for a professor of my reputation to be unable to give an explanation for this cosmic phenomenon.
Thus speaking, my uncle, half naked, pushed the spectacles on his nose and led us down to the port of San Vincenzo, where we set sail for France, and from there travelled back to our home in Hamburg. The news of our great adventure had swept right round the world. Hamburg laid on a civic banquet in our honour. The professor loved to tell the whole story of our experiences, omitting only the episodes with the compass. For a scientist to be baffled by such an unexplained fact is a mental torture. Back in his study, while looking at his collection of minerals, I came across the compass and started examining it. Then I gave a loud cry, and he came running to find out what had happened. "The compass!" I cried. "See, the needle points south, not north. The poles have been reversed." He examined the instrument. Then he leaped for joy, shaking the whole house.
So that is why we travelled south instead of north. But what caused it?
"It's simple," I said. During the storm, the fireball magnetized the iron on the raft and turned our compass topsy-turvy. The professor burst out laughing. From then on, he was the happiest of scientists.
Water.
Click here to start from the beginning.
Rafting the rapids.
Click here to start from the beginning.